Welcome everybody to the Central European Affairs podcast. My name is Zoltán, Kész, and I'm your host today. And my guest today is Bálint Magyar, who is the former Minister of Education from Hungary. He's a sociologist, and at present he is a researcher at the Democracy Institute of the Central European University. And the reason I'm making this podcast with Bálint is because his book, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, has become open access. Now, Bálint, can you summarize in a few sentences what your book is about, although it's going to be a difficult task to do it in a couple of sentences, I know.
Well, first of all, I wrote this book together with a young colleague, Bálint Magyar, who says he's a Bachelor of Economics at the Corvinus University, then a Master at the CEU and in Political Sciences. So we wrote this book together, and it was published, as you told, at the CEU Press. The main idea of the book is that if we want to describe post-communist regimes, those cannot be described with the help of the categories which are used for the description of liberal democracies. This approach, what we tried to go over, comes from an illusion, namely that around the time of the regime change, we thought that if the dictatorships are abolished, then there will be a royal road towards liberal democracies, and it's just a question of time whether these societies, these countries will reach the status of liberal democracies. But it did not happen. This illusion had a vast amount of literature dealing with this problem, and this was namely called the period of transitology, when they had this illusion that this is just a transitional period until they reach the status of liberal democracies. But around 2000, everybody had to face the problem that some of these societies, or even majority of these former post-communist, former communist regimes, they just do not want, in quotation mark I say, to transform themselves into real liberal democracies. And then the literature of transitology was replaced by the literature what I call hybridology, or when they try to create a scale between dictatorship and democracy, and then find different indicators with which they could scale the position of these countries to show where they are, but they still had the illusion that they can use the categories of liberal democracies to describe these countries. I thought that with my colleague that it's not a transitional period, and if we assume that the language for the description of liberal democracies can be used for the description of these societies, that we are on a bad track, and we have to change this. Therefore, we have to create a new language to describe these societies. And the book, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, is just a kind of textbook where we try to create this new language.
I see. Now, we are 31 years after the transition. What are some key features that characterize post-communist countries at the moment?
Well, I have to say that, of course, in spite of the fact that all these countries, before the regime change, were to be considered communist regimes, and it was a general situation that they could be characterized with two basic features, namely that there was a one-party system there, the rule of the Communist Party, which was declared even practically in all of the constitutions, that this is the leading force of the society on one hand. On the other hand, there was a monopoly of state ownership in these countries. But under the surface, of course, they had different historical tracks before they were forced into communist-type regimes. And without saying that there is a strict a severe past dependency, but there is a real difference in those countries, and this defines practically the different routes what they go through after the collapse of the communist regimes. Partly, just as an indicator, you can see that if you separate these countries along the lines of the major religions which characterize these countries, the Western Christianity, the Orthodox Christianity, and the Muslim, the rule of Islam in other countries, you can say that these cultural differences even live further as sociological and political borders along these countries, and there are very small exceptions, or very few exceptions, which can cross these borders. What means that the real historical historical ground of these differences is what we should say, that the differences in the degree of separation of social actions, the different spheres of social actions, politics, economy, and communal social actions. As we go further and further towards the east, the separation of these spheres is less and less, while in those former post-communist countries which did not belong directly to the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, this is much, the separation is much more progressive in the history. It means that these countries could go through different routes, and we wanted to abolish that view that it would be just a democracy dictatorship axis, but try to create such a description where the different types of so-called patronalism you could measure and see in these countries. When we try to define the different routes of which were followed after the regime changes in these countries, the so-called regime trajectories, we made the difference between the development of political institutions and the move within the political institutions, and on the level of a deeper level of patronal or anti-patronal transformation. And such a way, we use not an axis, but much more a kind of triangle, where we made, following to some extent the definitions of János Kornai, when he made the definition between democracies, autocracies, and dictatorship, but practically doubled all these categories. And within the field of democracies, we made a difference between liberal democracies and patronal democracies. Within the autocracies, made the difference between so-called conservative bureaucratic autocracies and patronal autocracies, and within the sphere of dictatorships, between the classic communist dictatorships and so-called market exploiting dictatorships. What is the main difference between the liberal democracies and patronal democracies? That in the case of patronal democracies, the political parties rivaling each other, they are nothing else, just a formal cover of rivaling patron-client networks. And we can speak about patronal democracies when none of these patron-client networks can reach and seize a monopolistic position, and they are not able to surrender to themselves the other patron-client networks. This can create a very delicate equilibrium, and for example, in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, could be considered to belong these type of societies. And the real question is that why these countries are not transformed into patronal autocracies, which is characterized with such a situation where one patron-client network surrenders the others and reaches a monopolistic position. If we want to find two institutional guarantees. How can you avoid such a situation for which is needed to seize the political power and have a monopoly of political power? Then you can see that there are two such institutions. First is the proportionate election system, and the second is the separation or divided executive power, where the government, the prime minister on one hand and the president of the country, both they have a certain big share in the executive power. And these countries with this situation can avoid to be transformed into patronal autocracies. In the case of patronal autocracies, when we make a difference between the so-called bureaucratic conservative autocracies and the patronal autocracies, that the bureaucratic autocracies can be considered a kind of classic autocratic societies where the political sphere is practically conquered by one political actor, but at the same time, the sphere of economy it's not transformed into patron-client relations. For example, Poland is going into this direction. The Kaczynski's regime differs a lot from the Hungarian one. They are both autocratic attempts. The Polish one is still an attempt. The Orbán's regime is not an attempt, but already a established autocracy, but they are different type of autocracies. In the patronal autocracy, what happens that the political actor, a political enterprise, practically invades the state and transforms the state into a criminal organization when monopolizes and centralizes the sphere and possibilities of corruption. And there the governance is operated like a criminal organization and transforms not only the political sphere, conquers not only the political sphere, but transforms the economic sphere into patron-client relations. In this respect, Hungary, Russia, and the Central Asian countries can be considered, former Central Asian Soviet republics, can be considered as patronal autocracies. And this is what I mentioned before, that Hungary is an exception towards the direction of the more Eastern type of autocracies, while from the other side you will see that, for example, Georgia is going toward the direction of a patronal democracy. Sometimes they try to reach the status of liberal democracies, what they could not fulfill yet.
Okay, now let's stick a little bit with Hungary, because you mentioned this is one of the countries which is already moving towards this very Eastern type of autocracy. Now, next year in Hungary, there is an election, and you as a former liberal politician and a member of a government, how do you see the chances of the opposition to oust this present government in Hungary?
Well, the chances are not really great. Of course, we have still bigger chances for this than, for example, in Russia, to abolish the autocratic regime, because we are still in the European Union. Therefore, it means some constraints in the case of Hungary. I have to say that there were already such colored revolutions in the region where people could change the process of creating a patronal autocracy in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Macedonia, in Armenia, in these places, where if we separate three stages of the autocratic transformation, the autocratic attempt, the autocratic breakthrough, and the autocratic consolidation, then in these countries, the autocratic breakthrough happened already, but the autocratic consolidation could not be fulfilled totally. And there were three major factors which helped to the people of these countries to get rid of these autocratic regimes, at least for a while. The three main factors is that the existential economic situation within the country, standard of living, and what happens with this in the previous years or before the Color Revolution. The second is that this is the system type corruption, where people confront with the idea that the corruption is not a scattered bottom-up process within society against which the government is fighting, but the main criminal actor is the government and the autocrat himself or itself. And the third one is when they could confront with the situation that the elections are stolen away from them by unlawful way. When these things coincide, then it has a bigger chance to get rid of these countries. But whenever it happened, and this creates a special cycle character in these countries like Ukraine, even Moldova, and these countries, that if this democratic breakthrough is not accompanied by anti-patronal transformation, then, of course, again creates such a situation when one patron-client networks try to monopolize its power and not act along the lines and along the norms of a democratic society. Well, now in Hungary, I have to say that we are in the third phase of the autocratic transformation, namely in the phase of autocratic consolidation. The difference practically between Russia and Hungary, that as we are the members of the EU, we cannot use so widely the means of physical coercion than the Putin regime can use them. This is why.
I see. Go ahead.
One thing. This is why, for example, why the propaganda is much heavier operated in Hungary, because the so-called convincing the people in quotation mark is much more important for them.
I see. Now, as for the next year's election in Hungary, there is a broad support of the coalition of all the opposition parties. They see that this is their only chance to have one candidate against the Fidesz candidate in each constituency. Do you think this is the recipe for success to defeat Orbán and his regime?
It's a necessary condition for that, but it's not enough, because now the opposition parties are somehow commuting between two approach towards this regime, namely whether you want to have a regime change, so you are under a system, you are operating along the lines of a system critic paradigm, or you are operating along the lines of a government critic paradigm. The government can be, the regime would be overthrown only on the base of a system critic paradigm, which means that it's not enough formally to come together and trying to have better results on the elections, but such a wide cooperation, it is needed from the right wing to the left wing. What's going on practically now among these parties, but I would say that the two moderate right wing political organizations should be incorporated into this cooperation. Yet what is one of them is led by József Bálint, former Minister of Economy, who was a minister of the Fidesz government. And the other is Péter Márki-Zay, who is the mayor of Hódmezővásárhely, that practically the whole ideological spectrum would be concentrated in one alliance. In this case, they could say that we represent a nation against a criminal organization. And this is what is very important, that if you want to have a regime change, and then you have to be very severe of denying the legitimacy of this regime. What is
I see
really,
now. Yeah, go ahead.
Then what is a very curious thing, that the people's voters, political actors of the opposition of the Fidesz, they are deprived by the Fidesz from this legitimacy practically since 2002. Why the opposition is very reluctant to deny the legitimacy of the Fidesz government, without considering them and declaring that it's just a criminal organization against which the nation has to carry out a kind of liberation war. I think that they cannot win on the election.
I see now. Just a theoretical question, a last question for this podcast. Imagine that in your constituency, the standing candidate is going to be a Jobbik candidate. Would you go and vote for a Jobbik candidate as a liberal politician?
Yes, I would.
Yes. All right. Well, this was a good final word from Bálint Magyar, a former Minister of Education. Bálint, thank you very much for participating on our Central European Affairs podcast. And I will leave you go. Thank you very much, Bálint.
Thank you very much as well. Goodbye.